Hello, friends of the internet, and welcome to our Martech webinar series. This one's called Multisite Solutions with Headless CMS, how to do this digital solution right. And I've got a special guest with me. My name is Joel Vardy, I'm President and CTO at Agility CMS, and I'm super happy to have my good friend Arjuna with me. Arjuna Shankar comes from Dot Fusion, which is an Agility CMS implementation partner. And he's been with, we've been working together and collaborating for quite a long time. And this is a solution where, where I think he has a lot of knowledge to bring. So Arjuna, tell us about yourself.
Hey gang, so my name's Arjuna. I'm a partner at Dot Fusion, which is a digital agency. We build websites, apps, all kinds of things to bring ideas to life on screens. We've also been building on Agility for, I think, almost a decade now. So
yeah,
we've really grown with Agility and watched them grow with us. So yeah, it's an old partnership, and actually Agility's office used to be down the hallway from our office like a long time ago, before I was with the company even. So yeah, it's been a long journey with Agility. So
yeah, it's been great. And you and I have collaborated on a lot of different features over the years, and different features and benefits and offerings that as sort of the idea of headless CMS has evolved, and how building with headless CMS has evolved in terms of architecting solutions. And it's interesting for you as a partner, you look after sites from multiple customers inside Agility. So as a partner, you're already doing multi-site type solutions. But then for any given customer organization, you're architecting multi-site solutions. So that's really what we're talking about today. And when we look at it, the idea should be that multiple websites shouldn't multiply your workload. That's what we're really trying to get towards today. And this is where, Arjuna, you're bringing a lot of knowledge to this game, because you've done this before, right? But just to bring our audience up to speed with how this can work, how you can bring all of your websites into one place with Agility CMS. So the one way to do it is with sitemaps. So a sitemap in Agility is basically a hierarchical list of your pages. And Arjuna, how would you describe when you're talking to your customers about sitemaps? How do you describe it to them?
well, I always use. I think it's always nice to talk through how things work. Everybody's used to browsers and used to put URLs in browsers, and I essentially say that sitemaps are ways to control those URLs on your
Right.
on your browser, how they appear, the site structure, whether one URL follows after another or before another, and how all those things connect. And a sitemap is a great way to visualize a tree-like structure of your site, and he does that extremely well. Yes.
Yeah. So what's interesting is a lot of headless CMSs traditionally haven't had the idea of a sitemap or pages on a sitemap that are controlled by the marketers. Oftentimes that's controlled by the developers. So this is something that Agility can do for you, and you can have multiple of those sitemaps in one instance. But you can also have just multiple instances of Agility that are controlled through your organization. And I think we're starting to see both of these as different concepts as people bring more digital properties into their organization. And in your experience, Arjuna, do people choose between having multiple sitemaps or multiple instances? What's the thought process that tends to go into it from your point of view?
So traditionally, or not traditionally, actually, let me say traditionally, because I honestly don't think headless CMS as a concept is something that new. It's been around for quite a while, though it's not been called that. And I think there are different approaches that you take for your different architectural problems that you have. Essentially, if you want to share similar code bases across things, especially share similar types of structured content, I always recommend sitemaps. Because then you don't have to keep creating definition lists, module definitions, so on and so forth, across the board, and you can just have all of them architecturally shared across multiple sites, all your components shared just on a higher architecture level. And where you can do that with instances as well, but there you start actually involving the developers one step more.
Right.
And where you have to say, okay, cool, someone has to remember to go into that new instance, make sure it's all updated as you have components updated across your instances.
Yeah, so with multiple sitemaps, we can share all the configuration all my team setup, it's all the setup, and we don't need to involve developers as much. And I think that's a real key for a lot of customers where they want to get everything configured and set up. Just do that once as part of their onboarding, and then just they're ready to roll. There's one other sort of methodology that I think you mentioned the word traditional and headless CMS. And I think one of the things we think of with headless CMS is the idea of a content hub, where irregardless of, which is not a word, irregardless is not a word, regardless of sitemaps and all those different things, if you just have content that's important to your organization, you can create a content hub for all that content and use that in all your digital properties. And I think if you're considering like things like apps, smart TV apps, mobile apps, these kind of things where you might not really have like pages as much, then that's where the content hub comes into it. And I think when you talk about websites, that's when the idea of sitemaps and instances is really important.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, I think like the way you've set it up with 1, 2, 3 is actually quite good to think about in the concept of one is, configure one time and then let the developers get out of there until you need a new feature, a new component. Right. And then instances is where you need a little more developer involvement every single time. And then Content Hub is where it's really like developers really, it shines for developers. Mm-hmm. And it's great when, like you mentioned, like with apps or, multiple channels where you want to send your content out, whether it's TVs or mobile apps or screens in a mall or wherever. Mm-hmm. Yep. Then Content Hub really comes into play. But it starts being a thing where marketers start having less control over certain things.
Right.
You need developers to interface to make some things happen.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think it's really important to get the marketers involved at the architectural phase of something and to understand who's going to have control of the content at what point. Because if you just hand it off to the developers, they'll create something that's friendly for developers, but might not be friendly for marketers. And I think that's one of the things where you guys, where Fusion has really shined as an agency, because you consider all the different angles, and that's super important. So cool. Yeah. So here's a question for you, Arjuna. How do we decide which solution or architecture to use when we have, and oftentimes customers come to us and we'll do, it'll be like, this is phase one, but we've got a lot of digital properties, but we're trying to figure out this. So how do you decide what solution or architecture to use when you're thinking about, the future?
Great point. So, great question. This is the biggest question.
Yeah.
Essentially, the way we roll this out is we don't start coding immediately, and we don't even start design immediately. The first thing we start is really start identifying who are the main actors. When we're dealing with this mm-hmm. this thing, the CMS that's going to be distributing content everywhere, mm-hmm. and when we think of those actors, we're thinking about actors who are going to be involved in the day-to-day of it. And invariably, there's two different big buckets of that. One is human actors and one is non-human actors. So you have non-human actors who'd be like, some API that's going to be pulling the content in, maybe right. That's going to be consumed by a mobile app or a TV somewhere in some other part of the globe. All right, cool. And then you have human actors, which would generally be, your users who are interacting with that content. And then you have this other human actor who's ridiculously important, and that is the human actor who is actually going in there and updating that content day in and day out.
Yeah.
And if you don't architect solutions for those people, the people who are going to be updating that content, getting that content in the flow of their day-to-day, mm-hmm. then you really start failing as an agency or as a partner of theirs. So that's the first consideration. So once we know who's going to be in there, who's going to be doing what, then we start thinking about other things. We start thinking about, okay, what are those other non-human actors? What is the technical proficiency of like the people who are going to be in the CMS? Are right. they developers? Are they marketing people? Are they people who've had experience with WordPress, right?
Yeah. Are they coming from something? Yeah.
Exactly. So all these come into play. On a very large level, essentially, we tend to recommend sitemaps to people.
Right.
There's some reasons for that. One of the biggest reasons for that is what developers would call routing, mm-hmm. Which essentially for non-developers is those URL structures that show up. Yep. all those different things, those are highly important, especially now in the world of like cutthroat SEO that's just going all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Want marketers to have complete control over their, their experiences, how things flow in and out. So in those cases, we actually, recommend things like sitemaps, because we can say, okay, you have a lot of control over that, how things flow.
Right.
And the cool thing about sitemaps is you can use sitemaps, and at the same time, you could use a lot of content, within your shared content to still power a content hub.
Right.
It's not limiting you in any way. And in
Yeah.
fact, it makes it more brilliant. So that's invariably what we end up choosing, but it's not a cookie cutter.
Awesome. Yeah, a lot of consideration about who we're working with, what kind of solution, who's going to be working with the content. Yeah, amazing. So much consideration goes into that before anybody starts typing. Nobody's typing code yet. Nobody's typing content in. We're going to consider all these things architecturally. Awesome. So my next question is, okay, so we've got this idea. You've done some architecture. How do you actually share? I talk about components, like visual aspects of code that developers write, I think is what I'm considering here. How do you share those across those different properties in a way that makes the most sense?
Well, tons of different ways. It depends. It depends on what the architectural problem is. So let's take the example of two of those things: sitemaps and instances. Right. Invariably, when we have sitemaps and we're using sitemaps to power things, it's very easy for us to basically share components, because it comes out of the box with agility. Right. Those components are exposed in the editor automatically across all the different sitemaps. So I can go in, I can see what components I have, drop those modules on my page, and then they show up directly. So it's very simple. When we have instances, and we have multiple instances, and we have to share components across instances, it gets a little trickier. And one of the reasons it gets trickier is that you have to maintain those component configurations into those instances also. Which means that, let's say somebody adds in their slideshow component the ability to have a subheading. Then you need to make sure you go into every one of those instances, add that single field in everywhere.
Right.
Think about what happens when you don't have that field, so on and so forth. So it increases the amount of, developer load.
Right.
But that being said, with agility, and actually not just agility, with any website nowadays, we actually use a bunch of boilerplate components that we have out of the box.
Right.
And what these are essentially, which is quite cool, is that our designer works with wireframes always. Our entire design team, they all start with just wires, putting things in there. But we have those wires available as components.
Right.
Which are completely, have no skin on them. They're literally just black and white, monochrome. They have the ability to drop colors, and start to extend on top of.
Right.
So essentially, those are our archetypes. And it's kind of sad, but I like the web from GeoCities days.
Yeah.
You put all kinds of crazy stuff everywhere and make everything fly around. And but if you look at the web right now, typically, you're not looking at a large set of components. You're primarily looking at maybe about 15 components, and then that's basically what happens on every site.
Right.
Components, a bunch of carousels, some kind of things that expand, contract, modals, the ability to do jump links. It's a very small set, and those are just repeated again and again and again.
So you've got, I would say, you call them black and white, or vanilla versions, unbranded versions of these that you can drop in easily to any agility instance or any project, and then skin them after the fact using the design and branding of the customer or that digital property. Awesome. So you have those available as a library, and you guys as a digital agency have created, I'm sure different versions of these, and you've got them perfected for all the different technologies. And so you just make that available, and agility just gives that to you. And you've mentioned the word module. So module is that's the properties for your component, right? That's the content that's going to drive that component. And agility lets you use that anywhere you want on a page. So amazing. So you've got that already out of the box. So working with .Fusion gives you that.
There's one more small thing here, which is that those archetype components, they actually they solve a lot of problems right out of the box, especially when it comes to things like, functional accessibility.
Right.
You don't need to sit and worry about maintaining your escape key again and again and again. It's
Right.
done once, right? And then you don't need to worry about it anymore. So that's kind of cool. It does not take into account, of course, visual accessibility, because that falls nice and well in the realm of people who put colors on things, and I'm
Right.
a coloring book guy.
Yeah. But so think about this though. If someone used a tool, had their own design and had a designer in something like Figma, how does that translate to the shared components that you were talking about? You know, someone comes to you or someone generates a Figma type design, and I think we know what that is. It's very visual. We know what it looks like. You know, you can kind of click through it a little bit to see what you're going to get. How does that translate to this?
So when it's Figma files that are used internally by Dot Fusion, we actually have prototypes in Figma that actually map to our vanilla components, so to speak.
Right.
So designers can like basically take those components and go about 75% of the way with the branding just by dumping color variables, so on and so forth. And then of course after that they add extra design elements, and then make it come through.
Yeah.
But those are all mapped, and those variable names, for example, in Figma, are the exact same variable names that are used in our code bases.
Right.
So we've spent about 2-3 years doing this and really coming down to a way where we can do it in a smart way. We spent a lot of time doing this with Sketch, and now of course we've
Right.
moved everything with Figma. And the whole scene is how do you take like human error out of the process,
Right.
and having developers make design decisions. Like developers shouldn't have to make design decisions or marketing decisions or SEO decisions, because we don't know all those things.
Right.
We're just humble people who type if-else statements.
Yeah, so that's awesome. But in terms of the process of, oh, I've got this, I want to do a new website, I've got this awesome design in mind, or someone's done some kind of visual mock-up, some graphic imagery potentially. So translating that from Figma into code, into content, you guys have really streamlined that process to take, as you say, to take the human error out of it, to sort of get the spirit of the design, correctly translated into code and content really easily. And I think that's a key part of sharing your components. Awesome. So what's an example of this? We've talked about this, in theory. Tell me about an actual example, because I know that you guys have done a lot of work, but there's something that I know you wanted to talk about, one particular customer.
We have multiple examples of this. I'm actually going to deviate a little bit and go to a customer we had with Agility, Dr. Pepper Schweppes.
Right.
And this was way back, and they were using Multisite with basically a number of sitemaps, one sitemap to power each website, and they had a very small subset of just 10 components to power everything that was needed on 4 of these FCMG type sites. Quite large, get a lot of traffic. They need to be visual. They need to pop a lot, lots of fizzy drink, bubbles, and so on. We basically had like this subset of components or modules, which were available to all of them. And then we had essentially a configuration object, which was sitting in shared content for each one of those sitemaps. And that configuration object had everything it needed to just put in all your stuff, like whether it be your colors, whether it's primary, secondary, tertiary, so on and so forth, whether it's how you want your shadows to appear on your site,
Right. All the configuration, yeah.
Every single piece of configuration. So tomorrow, if they wanted a new site, they simply had to reach out to Agility and be like, hey, hey Joel, give me a new sitemap, right?
Yep.
Or I think now within Agility, you can just add a sitemap right there.
Yeah, it's part of the licensing. Hey, I want to start off, I want to have up to 5 sitemaps or whatever. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so you can just click
yourself.
sitemap, put it in there, and then the only configuration you need to do is decide what your colors are and your all those variables for theming. Put your analytics keys in, and then start creating. So just hit new page, and then you're in, and you can go.
Right. So it's and oftentimes the question we get is, can the CMS do this, that, or the other thing in terms of specific features? And really, it comes down to the actual content architecture to float up all those different configuration properties to the content editor, and obviously, and have some kind of description with them to say, hey, this is what this does. This is what you're going to affect here. And then, so yeah, so that was one customer. And, I'm sure you got way more examples than that though.
Yeah, yeah, we have tons. I mean, we're actually in the process of doing this with Oxford Properties right now. It's fairly interesting. We have the ability to roll out sites that look radically different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you brought that up. So, for example, this component here where it says 149 Hayes, and if you could pull up the other screenshot. Yeah, so these are both using the exact same module.
Wow.
Right? They look radically different, like completely radically different from a content author's perspective. It's like, oh, okay, cool. Like you can just use these same modules to power very, very different looking things,
Right.
Yeah, so essentially when we're looking at how we can bring things up with components with shared items across sites. It's really a lot of the work is done up front by the thinking of it.
Right.
When like designers, for example, are not just thinking about, oh, this is going to be just some pretty thing that just arrives on the page. Our designers are also thinking, okay, what fields are going to get affected here?
Right.
They are thinking about things like saying, okay, how durable is this component or this module that we put in? Does this module have 70 fields? Okay, that's maybe a bit too much.
Yeah.
Right? It's got to come down. We got to have ways. Okay, is it unavoidable that this module has 20 fields? Okay, that's also too much. But what can we do within the CMS to make sure that it's labeled properly, put into different places, so nice and clean and easy to use?
Right. Yeah. And what you've done in terms of, this is an evolving thing, and the Oxford projects are fairly recent. And I know that one of the things is we actually, over the years, working with you guys, especially, we've actually adjusted licensing to make it easier for our partners and our customers to do those kinds of things, like add a new sitemap. It's part of the licensing that you already had, or maybe spin up a new instance that doesn't, it doesn't necessarily double the cost. There's like licensing packs that you can do. And I'll give you some contact details at the end of this to get more information about that. But so we've worked closely with you folks at Dot Fusion to make that easier. How have what is the customer experience like now when, moving from that first project that was, usually initial, hey, we're going to test it out and see what this headless CMS thing is like, or what's it like working with this partner? And then moving from that to the second and third and fourth project, how does the process change between the first project and the next ones?
Essentially, the first project or the first and second project is invariably where a lot of the thinking happens.
Right.
So, which means that it's slow to start invariably, because you got to iron out a lot of a lot of things to think about. Right. Right from what is your SEO strategy to like what is your content strategy? How many authors do you have? Do you have an editorial process? Tons of things. What kind of channels are you putting on? And invariably, clients don't know the answer to these things often, and we have to kind of guide them through the process of even how do you find these answers, right?
Yeah.
And that becomes heavy. But then once that's done, then it's just simply, okay, new sitemap, boom. New sitemap, boom. New sitemap, boom. Right. In some cases, we've also used, and this is quite old actually, like, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago when, you guys were rolling out headless for the first time, and your REST APIs were coming out. We didn't have that much flexibility with sitemaps. We were even doing things where, we were maintaining a single sitemap, but under that sitemap, we have multiple folders, and each folder is just a single site.
Yeah.
Right. Because you do have a little bit of developer stuff going on to make sure that like the folders are getting parsed correctly, so to speak. But then after that, we have clients right now who they need a new site. They just make a new folder and then they just keep going. Yeah. And it works really well for these one-off sites where they need like, one page and it's just a marketing landing page. It's going to last for, 1 month while a campaign is going.
Yep.
It's great for those kind of situations.
Yeah. And so this is really awesome. You guys have really innovated within the platform under multiple, iterations of that platform to drive results for your customers. And I think that's where the success has come from, because it's that constant, doing what the customer needs right now and meeting them where they're at. especially in terms of knowledge. Yeah, Arjuna, like hats off to you. You even though you're wearing a hat, my hat's off. To bring in that knowledge to customers, and a lot of time is spent just with education, especially up front. And this has been a part of that. This is awesome, Arjuna. Thanks a lot for joining me today,
Oh, no worries.
and for being part of this conversation. For everyone else out there, we want to continue this conversation. So by all means, follow Agility at Agility CMS. You can follow me at Joel Vardy on Twitter. This event and many other events are going to continue to happen. agilitysms.com/events. Webinars coming all the time. But you can also just shoot me an email, joel@agilitysms.com. And if you want to connect more deeply with Arjuna and Dot Fusion, I think the contact details are actually on our website, but you can also reach out to me and I will connect you with Arjuna and the folks at Dot Fusion. Arjuna, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been great.